Welcome to Unlimited Parenting. This is a podcast where we talk about what it's like raising children with developmental disabilities, any disabilities, special health care needs, and children's mental health concerns. Today, we are very excited to have a voice that has not already been heard on our podcast before. Today, we are being joined by Beth Markley, who is the Executive Director for NAMI Idaho. But you don't want to hear me introduce her. You want to hear from Beth. Beth, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you, first of all. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Beth Markley. As you said, my background, first of all, is not as a clinician. I am not a mental health professional. I am a parent of a young adult who has a serious mental illness. And honestly, the first I'd ever heard of NAMI was when I applied for this job. My background is really in nonprofit development and management, and that's what I had spent the last 30 years of my career on. And then I found this job. And like I said, NAMI at that point had been fairly low profile in our community. And as a parent of someone with a serious mental illness, I had been struggling to find resources, and I'd never heard of NAMI. So I was very excited about applying.
Now it's your personal mission to make sure everyone knows who and what NAMI is.
And it actually is, it's good. It's exactly what NAMI is, because we are a grassroots organization that started in 1976, just with a group of parents sitting around a kitchen table saying there needs to be more for our family members than there is right now. And so much of what we do is from the standpoint of people with lived experience. Our board, our staff, most of our volunteers, there are people who have lived experience with a mental illness or caring for someone who does.
Absolutely. And a lot of what I'm hearing is that it's similar to what iPool is doing, that got started around a small kitchen table with a group of parents who knew that there was more to life for their children in terms of education and being supported in the community. So it sounds like there's lots of tie-in already. Would you mind sharing what NAMI stands for?
Sure. We're the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and our network is, at the top level, we have our NAMI.org, NAMI national organization that develops programs and services that and promotes the research and advocates at the federal level for policies that affect people with mental illness. And then at the state level, we have our state organizations, which NAMI Idaho is one, and then we have our affiliates in the community. So in Idaho, we have 5 community-level affiliates, one in Sandpoint, Coeur d'Alene, Treasure Valley, Ketchum, and Idaho Falls. And we're working on developing 3 more in Pocatello and Lewiston and Twin Falls. So these can either be freestanding 501c3 nonprofits, or they can be under our fiscal sponsorship. But they tell us what is needed on the ground floor in terms of the education and support and advocacy in their local communities. And NAMI Idaho provides that at a statewide level. And what we do is there's 3 parts of our mission. Support is really the backbone of everything that we do. We have support groups for who we call peers, people with mental illness, adults with mental illness, and then we have support groups for family members who are living with folks with mental illness. And they are run with facilitated by people who have lived experience. They're very well trained and supported, and they provide a support group. It's not therapy, but it is. It tends to reduce isolation. People, it's a very debilitating and isolating thing to have a mental illness or care for somebody who does. And making sure that people are put in touch with the resources that they need, and get good advice from other folks who have been in their shoes. And these tend to make people, give people a feeling of empowerment, either to stick to a treatment program, to be accountable for their own actions, to create healthy boundaries, to care for themselves, to advocate for themselves or their loved one with providers and so forth. And those can be found all over, in person or virtually. When COVID hit, a lot of our support groups went online, and that was true nationwide. So you can actually join any NAMI support group that you need in the country. Go to NAMI.org and look for Family Support Group or Connection Peer Recovery Support Group. You can go to any support group that's offered virtually at any time. If I found one that was working for me in Minneapolis, I could go to that, as long as it's offered virtually. And you're going to get pretty much the same format anywhere you go. And what's important about having that local resource, though, for support groups is that, we know that our resources in Idaho can be very different from, say, resources in Minneapolis or Washington or Indiana or wherever, all over the United States. So it's good to have people who have walked the same journey as you have in your local community. The second part is our education. We provide evidence-based classes for people who are living with mental illness or family members who are caring for someone with mental illness. And those are for family members of people who are age 22 and below, and then adults over age 22. And then we have a number of other opportunities. We have advocacy training. We have sharing your story with law enforcement. We have NAMI Provider, which helps. So sharing your story is obviously about support, educating people, first responders and people in law enforcement, about what it's like to live with a mental illness, and when you call first responders, and what your experience has been. NAMI Provider. A lot of our medical providers get very little mental health education formally. So NAMI Provider is about alleviating that, giving providers a little bit more information and education. We have our NAMI on campus groups, which are mental health focused service groups, clubs in the high schools and colleges, and a number of other different things, depending on NAMI Home Front for family members of veterans and so forth. So we respond to what our communities tell us they want to do and what their needs are. And then the third element of our mission is advocacy. So I will be at the State House every January through April, advocating for policies that support folks with mental illness, including keeping Medicaid expansion in place, or making sure that our programs and supports are adequately funded. And I do this at the state level and also at the federal level. I'll be in Washington, D.C. next week for an Awareness Week campaign that on tardive dyskinesia, which is a condition that's a side effect of medications. So those are the three pillars of our mission: education, support, and advocacy.
Wow. I am just blown away. There aren't words for, especially, I think the part that calls to me most is that it is organizations that exist in the areas in which the individuals live, right? Because it is so easy for Allison in Boise to give you advice when you could be better supported by NAMI Far North because you're in Sandpoint, right? And we know that those supports and services are different. And there are some places in Idaho where you could, hop across the river and be in Washington. And those resources are different than being down here in southern Idaho. So that part really, as a parent of a child with a serious emotional disturbance too, I think that is highly supportive. Mm-hmm. In what you just described, is that a little bit about the parent support model? Or what does that look like when a parent reaches out to NAMI for support?
So one of two things happens. First of all, I answer every email that comes through. And we know it's not quite enough. We're working on building a more robust response, but I will get questions. For example, my son is about to be discharged from state hospital. What can I expect? What kind of supportive housing opportunities are out there, or where do I go to for, how do I find a resource for my family member or for myself living with this particular condition, I will do my best to answer according to what I can find. Every county in Idaho is a federally designated resource shortage area, and Idaho ranks pretty near the bottom in the United States in terms of resources. So, sometimes it's just a matter of let's talk through what your particular circumstances are and connect the dots, right? And then I'll refer them to, if we have a class going or coming up, or refer them to a support group. And I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. As a parent yourself, you're probably familiar with this sensation, because I think when we have kiddos who, I know my son broke his arm in the second grade, and the approach, both in terms of diagnosis and treatment and recovery, was pretty straightforward, and it was a moment in time. I think with a mental illness, what you're dealing with is buckle up. This is a lifelong condition, and in many cases, people are going to experience the very frustrating reality that it's going to take a while to figure out what the diagnosis is and how to treat it, and that recovery process is going to be a little bit zigzaggy and roller coastery, and it's you need to have all of the strength that you can in order to be the supportive backing for your loved one that you need to be.
And I think that that's a really good way to explain it. And I think that's why I also love the idea of a support group, because, we have our best friends and our loved ones who try their best to empathize, and they do the very good natured thing of trying to compare, what it was like for you as a child, or you really struggled with this too. But you just really also need a supportive community who can not look at you like you have five heads when you say, oh, it's the third time my third grader has had a threat assessment in his elementary school because he continues to make unsafe choices and yell out unsafe things, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously causes. And so I think a lot of people who are, parents of children who are typically developing, they glom on to those stories of, oh, you broke your arm. Those are very easy things for them to conceptualize and relate to. And I think that the tough thing is, for parents of children who have a serious emotional disturbance or early and persistent mental illness, they need someone who's going to relate to them in that same way. And I think
that's where resilience comes from, and that's where hope comes from, is being able to see someone and hear from someone who has lived your life, and to know that, to internalize the notion that recovery is possible, that there's a better future for you. Just keep trying. But if you hear constantly from people who just reduce everything down to, well, tough love this and boundaries that, and you start to feel very small as a parent, and like you just are a loser. It just is an awful, awful situation. And I know, my husband always says this, like, people can judge us all they want in terms of like what we've been through as a family. We have judged ourselves very harshly already, and nothing compares to that. But at the same time, just being able to compare experiences and recognize that it feels really hard, because it is hard. And it's not because you were a bad parent. It's just the hand that you were dealt. And to be able to get together with a group of people and share this experience is very powerful, and even to laugh. Humor is healthy, but people aren't going to get when I jokingly question my son's judgment, because at one point in psychosis he thought he was the Pope. So maybe I think that's a funny joke, but when people who haven't been there,
yeah,
look at me with that, it's.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
And it's like, no, that was funny. But yeah, it's that isolation is what I'm talking about. And when all your friends, their kids are going on and doing, accomplishing great things, and then they're like, how's it going with your kiddo? And, it's just it's a hard answer to give if you know that the response is going to be, you're going to be othered, right? Or you're going to be given advice that they don't have any right to give, because they haven't been there. Or it's going to be some sort of reductionist kind of nonsense about, that reduces you to an example or something. I don't know. And they mean well. I mean, your friends mean well. But a lot of times parents who come to my support group say they just clam up. They just stop talking about it because then nobody understands. And that can have just a tremendous impact on our own mental health as well.
Yes, I have recognized that too, where comparison becomes the thief of joy, as it were, right? Where I get stuck in this, well, according to my child's ages and stages questionnaire, right? We should be able to do X, Y, and Z instead of taking that time to reflect back on, what is it that Jack can do now that he couldn't do a year ago, right? So instead of taking that time to compare him to someone else, being able to be present in the mindset where I can, if I'm going to compare, it's to compare the growth from last year.
Yeah.
I think that that's really important too.
I mean, I'm dealing mostly, because this is a lifelong condition, I'm dealing mostly with parents of adults. The sad thing about the mental health, the mental illness and the progression is that on average, it will take 11 years for someone to go out and seek help for a mental health condition, or to recognize that they need help for that mental health condition. And now you're dealing with, onset as a child. A lot of times what we're dealing with is onset as a teen or later in adolescence, right? So sometimes mental illness is cropping up at a time when other behaviors are kind of expected, because teenagers are getting into that age where they're pushing boundaries and they're taking risks and they're rebellious, right? And that can also look very much like the prodromal phase, for example, of schizophrenia. People who have a little bit of paranoia, who take enormous risks. And it's also a time in the life of a young person when they're exposed to a lot of really unhealthy coping mechanisms. So it's really common, much more common than otherwise, for someone with a serious mental health condition to experiment with substances and form disorders from that. So that's on top of all of the other behaviors. And so you get this double whammy of the stigma of mental illness and, substance use or addiction, that people just feel like they know everything about addiction without ever having understood the very basics of it, which is, people don't want to live a life where they are, in the throes of that. And but the underlying issues that cause it are, if they're not being addressed, that can be very, very easy for someone to fall into the trap of the easy way out. And when you're talking about, very rigorous processes to address mental health issues and medications that could have some side effects that are really uncomfortable to debilitating, sometimes it's easier just to smoke something that you shouldn't be smoking, or to take something that you shouldn't be taking, to address the short-term issues that crop up. And especially when you're an adolescent, that can be really, really attractive, right? So, when I talk to people, I mean, they tend to be at their wits' end, like they've been through all of this stuff, and it's only been in recent years that their loved one has even approached getting a mental health, getting any kind of mental health treatment. And then what also compounds the issue is, for some of our, folks, they have the condition called anosognosia, which is poor insight. So if you're working with a minor who has a mental health condition as a parent, you have a lot of things to say about how that person is treated. But if you're approaching adulthood or crossing that magical threshold of 18, where you're supposed to be able to do all of your own, make your own decisions and so forth, but you have a condition that tells you that you're not sick, that you don't need treatment, that can be especially difficult and very burdensome on the families as well.
I'm hearing through that a lot of talk about awareness and ending like a stigma, like reducing isolation and letting people know, young people in specific, know early that there are other things that you can do and try before you do a band-aid, right, as it were, of a substance that you can just get your hands on, right? Is
Mhm.
that a little bit about, I was researching on your website, there's a presentation called Ending the Silence. Is that something that discusses, or can you talk more about that?
Yes. Well, a lot of what we do is focus on the issue of stigma and being able to have these conversations. And that's why we have people with real mental health conditions go out and discuss. And Ending the Silence is one of those presentations where we take young adult presenters who have lived experience and they go into the schools, middle schools or high schools, and share their stories. And it's just about education. And also, young people are going to relate more to other young people, right? So, just that's sharing a story about how you first experienced it, when you realized there was a problem, and in yourself or in somebody else, where you went to seek help, how things are going for you now, what does your ongoing recovery look like, all of those things, because they're not in the what to expect when you're expecting a handbook as a parent, right? But they're also not in any of the literature for young people. When do we know when there's a problem that we need to address? And so we do that in schools. We also have workforce presentations, like how to recognize when there's a problem and how to start that conversation with somebody you work with, either as a coworker or a manager or a leader. How to set a good example too about managing your own mental health care. We talk about the language of mental illness. Like, let's not make a diagnosis a joke. Um, and you don't necessarily you don't want to say the weather is bipolar. It's just weather. It doesn't have a diagnosis. You don't have OCD because you like your pencils in a certain way. You like your pencils in a certain way, right? Let's not assign ourselves a mental illness just to be funny. Let's not call people schizo because they're acting a certain way. We just are trying to avoid that. So it's language, it's awareness, it's people who are willing to share the story. One of our programs is also called In Our Own Voice. So we train people with mental illnesses to go out and give presentations to just people in general about what it's like to live with a mental illness. One of the things that I've heard a lot when I'm in legislative hearings from our legislators is this notion of the people who are, quote, I'm using air quotes, able-bodied,
Right.
using resources like Medicaid, like, different resources, as though, somebody who looks like they could swing a pickaxe should be able to find a job that has adequate health insurance to receive services. And the reality is, my son has schizoaffective disorder. He looks like he could probably, dig a hole or, hammer a nail or do any number of other things. And in many ways, he's quite competent. But in other ways, his condition affects his attention span. It can impact um, his cognition, his ability to reason. If he's in the throes of psychosis, he might hallucinate. He might develop extreme paranoia. So, he looks able-bodied, and I would just like to point out to our lawmakers when they use that terminology, it's a pejorative. It's assigning value to a person based on what they look like they can physically accomplish, and it's not helpful. It's not a helpful way to have a conversation about who needs resources in our society.
I echo that sentiment completely and would just add, as someone, my son is now in fourth grade. And when we're in IEP meetings or we're receiving community based resources, A lot of what we say is, Jack does look like he can do everything that everybody else can do. But remember, he does well when he can. He's not purposefully trying to be a bad kid. Again, I'm using those air quotes now, right? He's not trying to make you mad. He does well when he can do well. And that really speaks to the importance of empowering parents, right? On what to do, what to advocate for, and partnering with other members of the community to say, hey, just Magellan, Idaho's behavioral health program. These are some things that we're hearing from parents, or, being members in state level systems advocacy type meetings where we come in and say, these are things that we're hearing from real parents in Idaho. And I think that speaks a lot to that, is just letting people know that this isn't, our children may look able-bodied, but they do well when they can. And a lot of times when we're in a zeitgeist, in like a current environment of trying to like dismantle things that are preventative, that existed to support, so that we never got to the place where they couldn't do well, I think is another really big part of the conversation, is that no one wakes up saying, well, I hope I'm the Pope today.
Mm-hmm.
People are just always trying to do the best that they can.
Yeah. And at NAMI, we focus really on it. We know that early treatment, early identification and early treatment is the best possible approach to mental illness. And so, just recognizing that those things can, and just getting past that notion of, little Johnny is acting out because he's just a pill kind of thing. And like, what's the underlying issue here, and how can we work? And one thing you talked about as parents, we just have to settle into this notion that our kiddos are going to need a lifetime of advocacy from us. And that doesn't end when they become adults necessarily. But, sometimes we have to recognize that there are things that they're going to be good at. And then there are avenues that they're going to need a little bit of extra support from their team. And I'm part of my son's team. And it's a little bit more of a challenge than I think a lot of my friends have, who, aren't dealing with the same conditions that with their kiddos that I am. But, I'm glad that I'm able to do it, and I have the bandwidth to do it. And I will not stop fighting for, others to recognize that there are folks that we live with as a society that are going to need a little bit of an extra, a little extra hand. They're going to be a little bit more vulnerable. And that's okay, because thank God we don't all live with the same exact circumstances and the same exact conditions, because that would be super boring,
Exactly. It takes, in the words of the wise philosopher Robert Palmer, right? It takes every kind of people to make what life's about. It's not just one person doing things one way. In the spirit of feeling less isolated and stigma reduction and giving people a voice, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Can you maybe share what NAMI Idaho and maybe some of the other in the community affiliates are doing to mark this month?
Yeah, there's a lot going on. And, typically each of our affiliates will do, their own thing, whether it's responding to requests for presentations in the workplace or at libraries or, service organizations. We also are very focused at a high level. We have NAMI Walks events happening all over the state. Just a little plug for those. We have one in Twin Falls the first Saturday in May, and then Pocatello. Treasure Valley is the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. And then Idaho Falls gets into into June. Those are all at namiwalks.org/Idaho 2026. And then we have a couple of NAMI Walks in Coeur d'Alene and Sandpoint that are happening in late September, early October, because October is also World Mental Health Day, October 9th, I believe, or 10th. Anyway, so, that's about... It's not an athletic event. It's a 5K, but it's really about people coming together. There's little resource fairs in each of those communities. People can bring signs or make signs there, or wear T-shirts that says my company supports mental wellness, and or in honor of this family member who has a mental illness. They can walk, and it's just about raising awareness and starting those conversations. And so we hope people will register and reach out to folks that they know and say, I'm walking for mental health in honor of my family member or myself. And I hope that you will support me and we pitch news stories to the media about, here's the profile of somebody in your community who is living with a mental illness or who is caring for somebody who is, and why they participate in NAMI. And here's some information about NAMI programs. So we try to get that word out. And then we respond when there are other organizations that are, trying to promote mental wellness in the workplace or in schools, and, just in public. Because we know, I've shared this story before. During Mental Health Awareness Month, I tend to get people saying, isn't it great that there's so much less stigma about mental illness? And yes, as compared to, back in the day when my grandfather said he would never go to a head shrinker, again, quotes, a head shrinker for his bipolar disorder. And so it went untreated in many ways for most of his life. And he suffered for it. But stigma compared to that is decreased. But if you think about it, if you work in any kind of an office, of any size, you probably have somebody who just is assigned to make sure that birthdays are recognized, right? Or there's a coat drive if a family, experiences like some sort of catastrophic, like a house fire, or somebody to check in on the coworker who has a major medical illness. But when 1 in 4 people in the United States, or 1 in 3 almost in Idaho, experiences a mental health condition on a regular basis, that there's somebody coming into your office who spent the weekend at the emergency room with a suicidal teenager, or who's worried about a family member who looks like he's experiencing psychosis or some effects of substance use disorder, or something else. There's somebody coming into your office today who's just bleary-eyed and unable to focus because they're dealing with something potentially catastrophic. And the fact that nobody's asking them if they can start, bring them a casserole to get. And I say there's no meal train for a mental health crisis. And that means that there's still stigma. And so I just want to, we say it's not a casserole condition. And when my son was really, really ill and dealing with the effects of that, I had another gal in my friend group whose son was dealing with childhood cancer. And the response of my friend group to the two of us was very different. And I don't begrudge anybody any support that they get. I'm just saying, we had 2 children who were very, very ill. And the way, people respond in different situations like that is very telling. And so I can tell you that stigma is alive and well when it comes to mental illness. And we really want to turn that on its head.
Absolutely. Again, absolutely. You continue to render me speechless. I love the conceptualization of the fact that it's not a casserole condition. That's such a perfect way to add in when you're trying to help parents conceptualize, or even myself conceptualize, why is something that could also end my son's life not as important or not as worthy of support or kind words or validation as something else. And I think that again is incredibly powerful. Beyond Mental Health Awareness May and October, are there ongoing ways, especially related to ending the silence, for listeners who are personally affected or just want to be good allies to support what NAMI is doing?
Absolutely. And I would say the easiest way to know what's going on is to go onto our website and sign up for our newsletter. There's a little tab at the top, NAMIidaho.org. And we send out a newsletter maybe once a month, sometimes during the legislative session, a little bit more often, to keep people up to date on opportunities for advocacy at the state level and beyond. But I'll also, put the list out there in terms of classes we have coming up. And also volunteer opportunities. We will be recruiting for Ending the Silence volunteers. So if you are a young adult with lived experience, I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to be trained to go in and speak at in your schools. For young people who are interested in starting a NAMI on campus club in their high school or college, we need an adult advisor in each school setting and 5 students who are interested in forming that club. And I'm told that mental health service clubs are pretty rare. There's a lot of other types of service clubs, but mental health service clubs are pretty rare. These are not therapy and they are not support groups. They're about raising awareness among young people and doing activities that relate to mental wellness and mental health. And then also, just articles on what's happening statewide, or if it's Criminal Justice Awareness Month, or other awareness months that are out there that have to do with people with mental illness and so forth. And another resource that's on our website is our calendar. So all of our support groups are listed on our calendar, whether they are in person or virtual. And I encourage folks to take a look at those and go to a support group if you feel like you could need a little bit of extra help. If you have a person with a mental health condition and you just need to hear from other folks or ask questions or talk to people who've been in your shoes, go to one of these support groups. They can be life-changing.
And all of these resources that you're mentioning, so Ending the Silence, NAMI Walks, and NAMI.org are all going to be included in the description of this podcast with links. So they should be easily accessible for anyone listening who feels called to support or at least wants to learn more. I have one more question that I would just like to tag on at the end, and that is, what do you think is one thing that you would tell a parent right now who's struggling?
Be easier on yourself. You're not alone, and reach out to people who can understand your what you're going through, and that's not going to be everybody. It feels hard because it is hard, and the stakes are very high when it's your own kiddo, and resources are going to be hard to find, but they're worth it when you do find them. So don't give up. You've got that person who's counting on you, and also take care of yourself.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your dedication to the community. Thank you for keeping Idaho together and close-knit with all of the little satellite organizations. And I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so very welcome. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, everyone out there, for listening in. And know that if you are in Idaho or planning on moving to Idaho and have questions on systems or services for children with disabilities, please consider reaching out to us on our website at IPUL Idaho. That's IPUL Idaho.org, or by calling us at 208-342-5884. Be sure to tune in next time. Until then, this has been Unlimited Parenting.
Thanks for listening.